So, okay, if we're going to learn the lessons that we need to learn from this, it's fitting to go back and see how it came about. How it began was, I personally first learned about this through the Ben Shapiro Show's episode 622. Now, earlier this year, Brett Kavanaugh was handpicked by President Trump to succeed the Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, who retired at the end of July this year, 2018, after serving for 30 years, since 1988 exactly, on the Supreme He's still alive, 82 years old, and hopefully spending his last years with his family. That's how the elderly used to be taken care of and honored, provided they had been good parents and guides in life to the younger generations throughout their lives. How it used to work in communities, in families, is that when you got older, when you got to your elderly years, provided you did survive that long, was that if you had been a good parent, a good, productive, trustworthy member of society, and a decent guide to your other family members throughout your life in your elderly years, it would be your children and the rest of the family who would take care of you. That's how it used to work. We didn't. This is one of the real problems, actually probably the real problem with Social Security. It's destroyed this function of the family. Because since there's just money thrown at elderly people no longer have the motivation or loyalty enough to provide directly within the home, within the family. You may visit them once in a while, but you used to actually take care of them within one of the children's homes, depending how the adult children were dispersed throughout the country. You get the idea. And, if we brought that back, we could solve the problem of the gigantic cost that Social Security, at least for the elderly, is costing us. We just have to rebuild the structure and the function, those sort of functions of the family, which will take a couple generations. It wouldn't happen immediately, but eventually we're going to have to go back to that anyway, because the government does not have infinite money. So back to this topic for now. I'll make other videos about the family later. Brett Kavanaugh had, before now, served on the D.C. District Court of Appeals, so he's been at the center of the United States law and political central hub for quite a while. He has a wife who he stayed with and 2 children, so he has a stable family, which is too much rarity these days. I'm not going to talk about details of his family. I really don't think that should be done publicly. That's his private life, and it should be respected. And, being almost destroyed by this ridiculous, dragged out hearing, they deserve their peace. Or what peace they can have now, I'm still sure shock and trauma to them. He is, Brett Kavanaugh himself, is what's commonly called, I think I have this right, or some variation of this, an American constitutional purist, meaning he is, more or less, committed to interpreting the Constitution and its legal framework as having meant what it meant when it was written, and not to be too much tempered with. There's room for a little bit with the changing times, but not as much as what's trying to be done, should the leftists take total power, which is what we really need to stop them from doing. And Brett Kavanaugh is a barrier to anyone who wants to expand judiciary power of the government, which is actually a good thing, despite too few people really understanding why. Now, being the left, Democrats, and their multiple human resources minions and redshirt armies of social justice losers, and that is not as much my opinion of them rather than the flat-out truth as many would believe. Well, they want to overreach their powers of law interpretation to force tolerance of everyone and everything, except white Christian Westerners, the people who actually built the free world. The leftists are pretty upset. They want to keep Kavanaugh off the Supreme Court by any means necessary, which is always an extremely dangerous motive. Now, to get the full story, because I'm still chiseling away at my skills of articulation until I get to their fully realized form, you should really go watch Stefan Molyneux's videos and or podcasts about this subject. His podcast is Free Domain Radio, if you haven't heard of it before. Which, if you haven't, where have you been? But he has about 30 years more of experience speaking about issues like these and related ones than I have. You should also watch Steven Crowder's Change My Mind videos, because he is very good at trying to have civil conversations with everyday people out on the street. I mentioned in the last video, he does his setup, he gets permission, and he has a premise usually based around some kind of social issue, and he just invites people to change his mind about his premise. And the one I was referring to in the last video was about rape culture is a myth, at least in the Western world. In the first world, which it is, as I went over before, it's the Muslim countries, it's the African countries, it's the Central American countries, it's the countries where the drug cartels, the actual rape gangs are coming from, that really need the cracking down on their rape culture and their widespread and very eager tolerance of it. Not the first world. So why does the first world keep getting targeted? Well, this is something that Stefan Molyneux actually talks a lot about and has an answer about it. It's not a good answer. It's not that he doesn't give good answers. It's that the reason that the first world keeps getting attacked for all this is because they are the countries where there will be the least retaliation for attacking them, and that's not a good reason. It's actually not addressing the issue at all, because you are accusing the most women and children respectful countries of the worst things, which should even be re-explained why that's not the way you want to go about it. If you actually meant about solving things like that, but if you actually cared about solving these problems, but people want to attack and without the risk of retaliation. Taking into account just human nature, it's understandable, but it's not going to help. In fact, it's usually making the situation even worse, which is exactly what the attacks on Brett Kavanaugh did. They have made the situation of eroded gender relations even worse now. And I will talk about that in future parts. Again, I do want to keep these to around 10 minutes each. But, so, what happened with this case, with this hearing, was the Democratic Judiciary Committee began, after Brett Kavanaugh was nominated. Actually, they waited quite a while to do this. They began throwing around information referring to some possible sexual misconduct that he said committed against a woman back in 1982 when they both would have been high school age. Passed along that very sketchy information to federal investigators. There was some connection assumed without evidence of any connection to be between some expressed memories that this psychology professor, Christine Blasey Ford, who, being a psychology professor, should be very familiar with the unreliability of distant memories and should damn well have known better than to make accusations without some clear evidence, had been assaulted at a party at some unspecified time and place back in 1982.